More. Yes, yes, you're audible, but there's a lot of feedback. You're audible, but only erratically. There's a lot of feedback.
Sir, can you hear us now?
Yes, we
Hello,
can,
sir.
but it's a little erratic.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oof.
Nobody can hear me.
I'm trying to speak, but nobody can hear me. Can you not hear me? God.
ആളിപ്പോ സ്ട്രീം ചെയ്യാറിലുണ്ടോ?
ഇത് തന്നെയാണ് സ്ട്രിംഗ്
So can you hear us? Hello?
So we will start. We will start with the program.
Okay.
So we will start over again. Can we? We'll go for the oral presentation then. Sorry to have kept you waiting. We'll shortly start.
Okay, thank you.
Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. This rightly said quote by Shakespeare is very much apt for this occasion, proving his prominence in the 21st century. A very pleasant good morning to respected dignitaries. As long as human beings survive, Shakespeare's relevance is timeless because he has a better understanding of the human psyche than any other writer. The reach of the playwright is extensive, and people from all over the globe and all walks of life have read him, watched his plays, or have at least watched screen adaptations of his work. The fragrance of his novelty of ideas, even today, appeals to different levels of our life. The attempt to talk or write about Shakespeare can be a mammoth task. It is difficult to read or present Shakespeare completely using only one parameter because he himself is the universe of literature and the majority of the galaxies of his creation will always be remaining unreached. The gist of his creative work stands as the epitome of human life. The effort to understand and to relate the impression of his literary works in the fields of human nature, psychology, politics, and human relationships, theaters, movie adoptions in the context of 21st century may be interminable. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome respected dignitaries, teachers, scholars, and various academia on behalf of St. Thomas College, Thrissur to this webinar titled Resonating Wonder Shakespeare in Indian and Global Avatars, organized by the Research and PG Department of English. I invite the backbone of our institution, Reverend Dr. Martin K.A., Principal in Charge for the Presidential Address. Further, please.
Good morning to one and all. Dr. Jonathan Gil Harris, Professor and Head, Department of English, Ashoka University, New Delhi. Dr. Andrew Thomas C., the HOD, Biju MA, Assistant Professor and Coordinator of this program. Dear delegates, faculty members, dear students. Shakespeare's plays and poems, says Maggie Trapp, a critic, still matter to us because his plots still resonate. His characters still leave their mark. His language still moves and startles. His characters are ones we identify with. We understand Hamlet's despondency. We recognize Othello's envy. We feel Lear's decline. These characters are at once types and revelations. Shakespeare's characters are familiar, and at the same time, they surprise us out of our complacency. And in this way, they are endlessly fascinating. We can all relate to the feelings evoked by his stories. Shakespeare's language is gorgeous, his characters complex, and the themes love, honor, betrayal, envy, jealousy, fear, pride, lust, grief are all issues that matter to us today. We look to Shakespeare to make meaning of our experiences. Shakespeare's characters and plots are both of his time and for all time. His plays allow us to see ourselves anew. I'm very glad that the Department of English is organizing a webinar remembering Shakespeare, the legend of English language and literature. I'm very happy that Dr. Jonathan Gil Harris is giving us a session. I'm so glad that although we had some initial problems, he was very patient, kind enough to cope up with all these problems. Hope that these sessions will enhance our knowledge in Shakespeare, and he will let us have great sessions again. There are two more resource persons. Wishing all the best for this program. Let me conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Father, for those enlightening words. Today, we are all privileged to lend our ears to the intellectual deliberations. In the first session, we have with us Dr. Jonathan Gil Harris to steer with the topic Shakespeare in the Time of Pandemic. The second session will be joined by Dr. K. Muruganandan with the topic Facets of Shakespearean Reception in Colonial and Post-Colonial South India. And the third session will be engaged by Dr. Vikram Singh Thakur with the topic Bastardizing the Bard, the Curious Case of Shakespeare in India. I invite Dr. Andrew Thomas, sir, head of the department, to chair the session. Over to you, sir.
Good morning to everyone. As we begin the first session, Shakespeare in the Time of the Pandemic, let me take the pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Gil Harris, who is the professor and head of the department of Ashoka University. He has his bachelor's and master's degree from Auckland University in New Zealand and a doctoral degree from University of Sussex in Britain. He is truly an international professor. Prior to coming to Ashoka University in India, he was the professor at George Washington University, where he had been teaching since 2003. He has also held positions in Ithaca College in New York, the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and Professor Harris is the most experienced person we can have to speak on Shakespeare. He has a number of critical studies on Shakespeare, and his primary research interest is in Shakespeare, including the Indian adaptations of Shakespeare. Apart from his varied interests in modern English theatre, travel literature, colonialism, early modern English writings in India, and so on, he has, to his credit, a number of book publications, and many of these books are on Shakespeare criticism or adaptations of Shakespeare, and they are very interesting topics, but due to the lack of time, and an apology from the side of the department for this unforeseen technical failure, we are very pleased to have a very eminent Shakespeare scholar along with us, who has actually been as a fellow to Falter Shakespeare Library, the most prestigious library on Shakespeare studies, and who is the associate editor of the very famous Shakespeare Quarterly Journal, and the trustee of Shakespeare Association of America. Is also has been holding the position as the president of Shakespeare Society of India. Such an eminent scholar is among us today to speak on Shakespeare, who lived during, let's say, a recent time of the pandemic, the plague, of which he refers to in his writings. A very warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Professor Jonathan Harris, who will speak to us on the topic Shakespeare in the Time of the Pandemic. A hearty welcome to all aboard to listen to you. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Thomas, and thank you also to the principal Professor Martin, and thank you to Professor Biju for inviting me. As strange as it may seem, given my very pale face, this is something of a homecoming, speaking to an audience at St. Thomas College in Thrissur, because my extended family, my father-in-law's family, are from Thrissur. So I have to start off by saying Ningaloku engene anna. And I hope the answer is asale. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. I must bear some burden of responsibility for that. I was hoping to show you a PowerPoint presentation to accompany my talk, and that proved impossible with the platforms we're working with. So I'm just going to give you an oral presentation. In some ways, this is more faithful to how Shakespeare presented his thoughts too. He didn't have PowerPoint presentations. He didn't have elaborate visual spectacles. The power of the word was what took priority for Shakespeare. And I guess I'm going to have to rely on that and have faith that my word will reach you. Now, the title of my talk is Shakespeare in the Time of Pandemic. And I'm referring to both our time, what Shakespeare has meant to us in the time of pandemic, but also to his time, because Shakespeare himself lived through a time of pandemic, and it greatly affected him. Shakespeare was no stranger to pandemic. It shaped his thinking, his language, and his career in ways that now in 2022 might seem uncannily familiar to us, particularly here in India. Picture this. An epidemic is ravaging the capital of the country. Healthy people are falling ill with fever, aches, dry coughs. Many die within a matter of days. Fear grips the city. A migrant worker, one of many in a city swollen by people desperate for economic opportunity, faces a difficult decision. His livelihood has disappeared overnight. The place where he works, located in a poor, informal settlement in the city's northeast, has shut down, and his company has disbanded. He has to find another source of income. And that means walking back to his village, about 60 kilometers from the city, or finding employment elsewhere in the countryside, far away from the outbreak. Now, you might think, hearing these words, that I'm talking about the plight of, say, a Delhi migrant laborer. But I'm actually talking about William Shakespeare, who was a migrant to London from his village of Stratford, and what he experienced in 1592. Now, in August that year, London witnessed its most horrific outbreak of bubonic plague in over a century. The disease was conveyed by black rats carrying infectious bacteria. But before the invention of the microscope and the discovery of microorganisms, plague was attributed to other causes: bad air, or what was known as miasma. It was also attributed to malevolent Jews who were believed to poison wells. But most commonly, the plague was believed to be the will of an angry God intent on punishing sinners. Now, for those who contracted it, the bubonic plague was virtually a death sentence. Around 20,000 people, by some reckoning nearly a fifth of London's population, would die by the end of 1593. And that's just an extraordinary amount of carnage. Now, Shakespeare at this time was just starting off as a playwright and actor in London. His career to date had not been particularly distinguished or, one presumes, particularly lucrative. And it was certainly not reputable. It's hard for us to believe now because we think of Shakespeare as Shakespeare, the pinnacle of literary accomplishment. But to be a playwright in 1592 or 1593 was to pursue a very, very dubious profession. London's Puritan leaders regarded the theatre as a den of sin, and they believed that theatre provoked God's anger because theatre involved boys impersonating women, but also poor players impersonating kings. And the Puritan leaders believed these to be sinful impersonations. This sin, they said, was the cause of plague. And as a result, they ordered the closure of the playhouses, including Shakespeare's then theatre, which was known simply as the Theatre, which was located in London's northeastern suburbs. Now, these theatres weren't to reopen for 2 years. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? A 2-year pandemic. This was social distancing, 1592 style, born of a fear not just of contagion, but also of moral uncleanliness. Late 16th century London's response to the plague, panic, paralysis, an exodus of migrant labour, blame, closure of theatres, also seems uncannily familiar to us in the age of COVID. Even the muddled thinking about the origins of the disease rings bells. The compulsion to blame the spread of disease on a malevolent minority group, even the rush to demonize the nation's entertainment industry as a source of moral corruption that rivals the threat of the pandemic. As we can see, Shakespeare's London had its own versions of the Tablighi phobia and the Riya Chakravarti hysteria. Shakespeare himself, however, responded to the pandemic in very different ways. Now, we know very little about Shakespeare's life, least of all his early years in London. But we do know that for nearly 2 years after the plague pandemic struck, he didn't write for the stage. Instead, he turned to poetry. During the lockdown of the theatres, Shakespeare published 2 long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. Both were clearly written by someone who had pandemic disease on his mind. So in The Rape of Lucrece, Lucrece's violator, Tarquin, is compared to a public plague, as if he, in all his evil, embodied the pandemic. And Venus tells Adonis, the object of her unrequited affection, that the plague is banished by thy breath. All I have to do is kiss you, and it's the equivalent of a vaccination, a double vaccination, and a booster shot. Venus and Adonis is less a celebration of erotic love in the style of Shakespeare's source text of its metamorphoses than it is an extended lament about the shocks of disease. Venus spends the last part of the poem, after Adonis has been killed by a boar, chiding death. And she says, "Grim, grinning ghost, earth's worm, what dost thou mean to stifle beauty and to steal his breath, who, when he lived, his breath and beauty set gloss on the rose?" The image of a rose and its lost beauty glances back to the poem's very first reference to Adonis. Shakespeare describes him as rose-cheeked Adonis, and roses are associated with Adonis throughout the poem. Indeed, flowers haunt the entire poem as a kind of shorthand for the object of Venus's desire. Her long disquisition on love in a new era of plague and sudden death again evokes the image of a destroyed flower that glances at Adonis. And this flower suggests not the goring that Adonis has experienced when he's killed by the boar, and the boar sinks its tusks into Adonis's flesh. Instead, Venus imagines his death as a blighted infection reminiscent of the plague. It shall be fickle, false, and full of fraud. Bud and be blasted in a breathing while. Love, Venus says, is a bud, a rose, that stands to be blasted or blighted, struck down by disease in the instant of a breath. In this, she echoes what she said earlier to Adonis, trying unsuccessfully to persuade him to have sex with her so he can produce an heir. Again, she compares him to a flower. She tells him, beauty within itself should not be wasted. Fair flowers that are not gathered in their prime rot and consume themselves in little time. Now, these are standard images of transformation and metamorphosis that Shakespeare had found in Ovid's Metamorphoses. But in the context of the plague pandemic, it's hard not to see the prospect of wasting, rotting, and consuming fair flowers as a case of Shakespeare adapting Ovid's classical images to express a new emotional reality, a horror at the sudden omnipresence of death, striking down youth arbitrarily, capriciously, and with no warning. Venus and Adonis was written by a poet who also seemed to have internalized something of the hatred of theatre of London's Puritan leaders, the people who'd closed the playhouses. Shakespeare evidently believed that his earlier plays, which at this point included a few Masala comedies about separated brothers and the travails of love, that's the Comedy of Errors and the Two Gentlemen of Verona, some history plays about England's medieval kings, such as Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and a gruesomely violent tragedy in which a character is turned into a meat pie and served to his mother for dinner, that's Titus Andronicus. Shakespeare obviously thought all these plays were insignificant and frivolous. He wrote a letter that accompanied the first edition of Venus and Adonis. And in the letter, he called the poem the first heir of my invention. So he was saying to the public, this is really the first thing I've ever written, Venus and Adonis. All those plays I wrote before, plays that we now study as masterpieces, he disavowed with the stroke of a pen. But if Venus and Adonis was the first heir of Shakespeare's invention, it seems that Shakespeare also had in mind another heir, an heir without an heir. Now, both Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece are dedicated to a man named Henry Rosley, the Earl of Southampton. Rosley, which was often pronounced Rosley, was just 19 at the time. He was an heir to an earlship and a fortune. He had inherited both upon the death of his father when he was just a child. By 1592, he was already a notorious figure. He was charismatic, he was strikingly good looking, but most importantly, he was provocatively effeminate in his hairstyle and appearance. He had very long hair, he wore lipstick. Many people thought he looked like a woman. He was also something of a wastrel playboy who preferred the company of men to women. Modern scholars pronounce his name as Rosley, but there's a lot of evidence that Shakespeare and others pronounced it Rosley, and that the male admirers of the Earl of Southampton called him Rose for short. This man who looked like a woman, they gave him a woman's name. It's hard not to hear subliminal references to Rosley. in the many associations of Adonis with a beautiful but easily blighted rose throughout Venus and Adonis. Rosley's legal guardian was a very powerful man named William Cecil. He was Queen Elizabeth's senior advisor and also her spy master, sort of the equivalent of the head of the CIA. In 1592, William Cecil resolved to put his foot down. Gossip was circulating about Rosley's habits, and his favorite night haunts in London's Strand, the place where you go out at night to get drinks and do all sorts of things that you're not meant to do. Cecil said this is not the safest place for his nephew to be during the time of plague. He was determined to discipline his nephew. So William Cecil tried to get Rosley married to the Earl of Oxford's daughter. But young Rosley refused. An impressive display of will or recklessness, given that the Queen's powerful counselor had ways of getting people to do what he wanted. I mean, he was, amongst other things, a master of torture. Now, how had Shakespeare come during his pandemic to be dedicating poems to a young teenaged scoundrel who refused marriage? I can almost imagine Fahd Fasil playing him in the movie version, the Malayalam movie version of Shakespeare and Rosley's life. Dedications of poetry at this time were not just outbursts of affection. They were carefully composed notes of gratitude to a patron or a benefactor. And Shakespeare's two dedications for Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece have to be read this way. Rosley, or someone in his family circle, perhaps William Cecil himself, had almost certainly paid Shakespeare to compose these two poems. So Shakespeare was writing for money. This is how he supported himself during the pandemic. It's quite likely, too, that Rosley or William Cecil gave Shakespeare roof and board outside the city, where he tided over the pandemic. Now, Shakespeare obliged by writing Venus and Adonis, in which the object of Venus's affection is a stunningly handsome boy with the beauty of a girl. Adonis not only refuses the sexual advances of the goddess, but also spurns the idea that he should be with a woman at all. All he wants to do is hunt boars in the company of his male friends. One presumes that Shakespeare's dedicatee, Rosley, surely saw himself glamorously reflected in the rosy-cheeked, androgynous Adonis, who is described as the field's chief flower, sweet above compare, stained to all nymphs, more lovely than a man, more white and red than doves or roses are. Rosley may have cheered too at Adonis's articulate refusal of union with Venus and his defense of hanging out with his boyfriends. But the message of the poem ultimately bends to the arc of Cecil's camp, as Adonis is ultimately killed in his pursuit of all male pastimes at the expense of heterosexual love and marriage in the way that Venus recommends. Venus keeps saying to him, come on, get married to me and have a child. And Adonis keeps saying, no, I don't want to ever get married. I just want to hang out with my boys. Now, in a time of pandemic disease, Shakespeare seems to be suggesting that death comes prematurely to those who do not abide by the imperatives of the social order, even those who are dazzlingly, charismatically at odds with it. Shakespeare's dedicatee, Rosley, must have noted this too, not least because Shakespeare had already told him versions of this in a sequence of poems that would only be published much later in 1609, but most of which had been written many years earlier, almost certainly during the 1592-1593 plague pandemic. And what am I referring to? The Sonnets. Henry Rosley is the leading candidate for the identity of the mysterious fair youth of Shakespeare's sonnets, many of which Shakespeare also composed during the pandemic. The fair youth, like Adonis, like Rosley, is a young man who refuses marriage and is androgynous. Shakespeare refers to him famously in Sonnet 20 as the master mistress of my passion, both male and female. Now, the sonnets are often not taught in India, largely because of the prudishness of the British colonial authorities who cavilled at frank expressions of same-sex love. But Indians might also detect another familiar motive running through the sonnets. Shakespeare, sounding like any Desi parent, addresses the fair youth as a beta, as they say in Hindi, who should settle down and marry, and for one sole reason, so his beauty can be immortalized by a bacha, by a child. Now that motive seems to have acquired extra urgency in a time of pandemic when a significant number of Londoners, including young men like Henry Rosley, were literally dropping dead with plague. Now there are uncanny similarities between the opening sonnets and stanzas from Venus and Adonis. In Venus and Adonis, we hear the goddess ask the rosy-cheeked Adonis, "Is thine own heart to thine own face affected? Can thy right hand seize upon thy left with love? Then woo thyself, be of thyself rejected, steal thine own freedom, and complain on theft. Narcissus so himself forsook, and died to kiss his shadow in the brook." So what Venus is basically saying to the fair youth is, you're totally in love with yourself. What a waste. You're just like Narcissus from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the young man who fell in love with his own reflection and ended up dying staring at his reflection. So what Venus says is, if you don't stop being in love with yourself, you will die. You need to marry and have children. Now compare this to Shakespeare's censure of the fair youth in the first sonnet. Shakespeare says, "But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies, thyself thy foe, thy sweet self too cruel." He's saying exactly the same thing. Fair youth, you are in love with yourself and you're going to die if you continue to be in love with yourself. Now, immediately before this, Shakespeare says something else evocative of Venus and Adonis. He tells the fair youth, "From fairest creatures we desire increase," meaning from the most beautiful creatures we expect children, "that thereby beauty's rose might never die, but as the riper should by time decease, his tender air bear his memory." Now Shakespeare, very interestingly, puts the word rose in italics. Beauty's rose might never die. Most critics read rose just as a metaphor. They say perhaps it refers to the Romance of the Rose, which was a very popular medieval story. But the italicization of the word rose surely involves more than a nod to literary convention. It reads as a proper name, Rosley, Henry Rosley. Lurking in the image of the rose, as we've seen, is also the spectre of blasting rot and death in a time of plague. Shakespeare is saying, "Rose, you may die in this pandemic. Please don't die. At least produce a child that will live on after you. Now, roses had also acquired an association with plague by 1592. As the COVID pandemic began to strike in England in 2020, Londoners, haunted by the cultural memory of a much earlier pandemic, took to singing an old children's folk song as they washed and sanitized their hands. You may know it. Ring a rosies, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Now the story goes that this song about ring a rosies, far from simply being a playful ditty to accompany a children's game, is a veiled reference to the bubonic plague pandemics of the 16th and 17th centuries. There are a large number of online sites that will tell you a ring of rosies is an old term for the festering red pustules, or buboes, that gave their name to the bubonic plague. And a pocket full of posies, flowers gathered in a little bouquet that you can sniff, were often used to protect the breath from the evil miasmic odors of London, and therefore as a way of avoiding illness. A tissue was a reference to the sneezing that plague victims were supposed to succumb to just before dying, and we all fall down refers to the suddenness and widespreadness of death from plague. Now, it's a nice story, but sadly, like many stories, it's too good to be true. There is no historical evidence whatsoever for the song having been either composed or sung during the plague pandemic. The earliest instances of the song date to the 19th century, but these make no reference to a tissue, we all fall down. These lines seem to have been incorporated into the song only in the 1950s. But as is the case with so much fake news these days, repeating the story often enough made it acquire the weight of indisputable fact. Still, there may be a kernel of truth in the story, because roses were associated with the plague, not as metaphors for the buboes or blisters of plague, but instead because of their general association with posies, the flowers that people would sniff to try and ward off the plague. Shakespeare seems to have known that the perfumed sweetness of the rose was used by people to ward off the plague, but was still no weapon against death. Indeed, he feared that sweetness was often a deadly cover for death. And he would, throughout his subsequent work, associate flowers with hidden danger. Think of Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet. This is one of Shakespeare's first plays that he wrote after the end of the plague pandemic. The friar is an avid gardener and a florist come apothecary, and he tells us, within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence and medicine power. For this, being smelt, with that part cheers each part. Being tasted, slays all sense with the heart. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eat up the plant. It's a familiar image to us by now, that the rose gets blasted by plague. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth tells her husband to look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. It seems like Shakespeare, for the rest of his career, associated flowers both with innocence, but the possibility of death lurking beneath it. I would suggest that's a memory of the plague pandemic. Now, in the sonnets, Shakespeare avoids romanticizing marriage. He presents it instead as a shrewd business proposition. he describes the fair youth, childless, as a profitless usurer. A usurer is a money lender. And he's saying, you're not lending money, you're not getting profits on your investments because you're childless. And he asks him, when nature calls thee to be gone, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? Having a child is a good business venture, Shakespeare's saying. He advises him also, pay the willing loan of your beauty through marriage, with the implied dividend of a child. So this suggests how Shakespeare strategically pitched marriage to a young man who is almost certainly not sexually interested in women. But it also shows how thoughts of making money and persuading Rosley to do the socially expected thing guided Shakespeare as he wrote the sonnets. A poet for hire in the time of pandemic, he was quite possibly acting under the extra patronage of Rosley's powerful guardian, William Cecil. Poverty and social irresponsibility are not the only plague time fears lurking in Shakespeare's sonnets. Shakespeare says in lines that again resonate with Venuses in Venus and Adonis, beauties do themselves forsake and die as fast as they see others grow. Comparing the youth to a summer's day, he frets that rough winds do shake the darling buds, the flowers of May. In a time of epidemic disease, death is not just an inevitability that will wipe out what we know and love. It can also strike abruptly when one is in one's prime. And I think this was one of the biggest traumas of Shakespeare's plague pandemic, that young people were dying in droves. As the sonnets proceed, Shakespeare turns down the volume on his beta shadi karo, as they say in Hindi, act. He stops saying, child, get married. But he doesn't let go of the fear that death might strike the fair youth at any time. So the need to grant everlasting life to a beloved who may die any moment remains the theme of the sonnets. Eventually, it's not just a child, but also Shakespeare's lines that will lend immortality to the mortal fair youth. Shakespeare tells the fair youth, you should live twice, in life and in my rhyme. Not even Shakespeare could have realized how prophetic these lines would be. The fair youth still lives every time we read the sonnets. He's living right now as I talk about the sonnets. And this is something of a paradox, given that Shakespeare never names him, other than that oblique reference to Rose, and never describes his physical appearance. So the fair youth is vividly alive for us, yet we cannot see him and we cannot name him. What has been immortalized, though, is less the youth than Shakespeare himself. And in particular, Shakespeare's own desire to live. And after going through the pandemic, this is what strikes me when I read the sonnets now, in a way I'd never realized before. Throughout the sonnets, Shakespeare is screaming a hope that he will survive, that he will stay alive. For what we witness in the sonnet sequence is an astonishing transformation, guided by a professional imperative to tell a patron's wayward nephew to get married so his beauty can live on in his heirs. Shakespeare's advice about how to avoid death begins to break apart. Instead, he taps into a mounting personal anguish that he too will die, and that he too must find ways to survive an end that cannot be escaped. There are arguably other traces of the traumatic memory of the pandemic in Shakespeare's plays in 1594-6, after the reopening of the playhouses. These stage emotional hardship that acquire an extra resonance for us in our time of pandemic. We might think of Romeo and Juliet's depiction not only of young lovers struck down in their prime, but also of a man's sudden exile from his city. Romeo suddenly has to leave, just as migrant laborers have had to leave their cities. The Merchant of Venice's presentation, the real threat of the abrupt loss of livelihood, of losing your career and your entire fortune overnight. And maybe most of all, the taming of the shrews story, that Caterina and Petruccio's tale is in fact performed by a traveling theatre group who presumably have had to flee the city in which they're based and play for hire in rich lords' houses. This is a reality that Shakespeare and his company certainly had to endure in the latter end of the plague pandemic. But it's the sonnet's fear of death, and even more, the desire to live, the fantasy of surviving our own demise, that resonates most for me as the telltale sign of someone who has lived through a pandemic. Until 2020, we'd largely forgotten how this cluster of fear, desire, fantasy, not just Shakespeare's, but also our own, is activated and augmented in a time of pandemic. And maybe that's one of the reasons why during this COVID 2 years or 3 years, we've turned so much to poetry ourselves. It's something I've seen everywhere. My students are not only reading, but writing poetry in a way I've not seen for decades. Everywhere, on social media and in print, people are suddenly reading it, writing it, consuming it, longing for it. In the poetry we read, voices from the past come alive and speak to us from beyond their graves. In the poetry we write, we live twice, in ourselves and in our rhymes, or blank verse, or ghazals, or nazms, or pattas. Shakespeare's response to his pandemic reminds us how poetry clings to the hope that in a world where death has suddenly become much more real and omnipresent, life might somehow continue, not just in us, but also beyond us, in our written words. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, if there are questions, and if there's time for questions. Are there any comments here?
Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan Harris, for this excellent presentation on Shakespeare in the time of the pandemic. You have, within this short duration of time, extended your lecture to the complete works of Shakespeare, his verses, his sonnets, his tragedies. You have taken us through the Shakespearean writings to present to us how Shakespeare confronted the time of the pandemic and how we too can actually face the troubles and tribulations of our own times through these writings of Shakespeare. The session is open for questions. Let's see if there are any questions on the chat box. And Sir, it was an excellent presentation. We would move on to the next item in the program because I don't find any questions in the chat box. But definitely, you have made us a wonderful presentation, despite the visuals that we would have longed to see how you had presented this topic with your PowerPoint presentation. Unfortunately, we couldn't because of the technical failures. We hope to have you with us physically, perhaps later on, maybe in the next academic year, when we hope we will have our normalcy returned. We hope to host you here, especially as you are very close to Kerala, and since your heart longs to be in Thrissur, we hope to have you with us. And I'm sure that Professor Biju will host another seminar next year, perhaps, where we will have you with us. We are very grateful from the side of the Department of English that you were present online, in spite of all the hurdles that were there initially. And I congratulate Professor Biju for introducing you to the Department of English and to the college, to the students. Thank you very much. Let's proceed with the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you. Asale.
Thank you, sir, for such a vibrant session. It was a really engaging one. Gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from the soul. Hence, I invite Harida, First MA English, to propose the vote of thanks.
A warm, very morning to one and all. It is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks and acknowledge the contribution of those who worked really hard to make this event possible. On behalf of my college, I extend a hearty vote of thanks to our chief guest, Dr. Jonathan Gil Harris, who spared time from his busy schedule to grace the occasion. Today, we had an opportunity to listen to your highly entertaining section, and you have provided a great number of ideas. We have no words to offer gratitude for your valuable presence here. You gave deep insight into the topic and revealed some interesting facts. We are eagerly waiting for your forthcoming books and best wishes for your future endeavors. Thank you, sir. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation to Dr. Andrew Thomas, Head of the Department English, for being the catalyst that stimulate us to do our best. Thank you, sir. I extend my sincere gratitude to the convener of this wonderful event, Mr. M.A. Biju, for working untiringly to make this event a grand success. Thank you, sir. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to all the participants gathered here. Without you, this event would not be a success. Thank you all.
Thank you, Harida. With this, I depart and I hand over the session to Angelin to host the rest of the webinar. Thank you.